Welcome to Daily Life Connection. Today we're going to continue to explore together who God is and what difference that makes in our lives. In Psalm chapter 3, there's an interesting verse, verse 7. Rise up, O Lord, deliver me, my God, for you strike all my enemies. I want to talk a little bit about God the striker. Now, I know this is stretching. This is not what the scripture meant, but I love soccer. I love watching soccer. And the strikers are the forwards who are primarily the goal scorers on the team. And their job is to score against the enemy. Their job is to put away the enemy. So in a sense, it has a similar kind of function here. But I know the Bible's not talking about soccer, but I'm just using that as an illustration today. God is a striker. He's the one who scores against the enemy. He's the one that puts the enemy away. In soccer games, they're not very high scoring, as most of you know. And, often if it's getting down towards the end of the game and one of the strikers goes in and scores a goal, and now they're up by, 2 or 3 scores over the opposite team, the announcers will say, he just put away the opposition. He put away the enemy. They're struck down by the striker. Well, David in his writing is saying that when it comes to my enemies who are trying to score against me, the enemy of our soul particularly, trying to score against us, set things up to take us down, take us out, God is a striker. God will strike them. He will rise up against them. He will do whatever is necessary to defeat our enemies. That is incredibly good news for us today, isn't it? God is a striker. God will take care of the enemies. Now, I have to be honest, there's times when I wish he'd do it quicker. When I'm watching a soccer game, I like to see my team, the Toronto Football Club's, the team I cheer for in the MLS, and I like to see them score early on. I like to see them score 2 or 3 goals in the first 10 minutes, and then we can kind of breathe easier and throughout the rest of the game. But sometimes God doesn't strike that way, does he? Sometimes he doesn't strike our enemies at the very beginning of a situation or circumstance that we find against us. Sometimes it's like in the last minute or in overtime. But the good news is this. It's not that God will always strike our enemies early on. Some things, some circumstances have been, seem against us in our lives for years and years and years. And we don't see resolution. We don't see the enemy defeated. But the good news is this. Whether it's in the first half, whether it's in the second half of the game, or whether it's in overtime, our God will strike the enemy. And the enemy will not win. His plans and purposes cannot stand, the scripture tells us. God's plans, God's purposes, those will stand. And sometimes God does it by striking the enemy. Now, of course, we know the greatest strike, the final nail in the whole thing, was Jesus dying on the cross. That was the final strike against the enemy, robbed him of all his powers and disarmed him, the word tells us. That's amazing, God the striker. But as David wrote too, he does strike our enemies. So, whatever situations we find ourselves in today, let's just take them to the Lord and say, God, will you be my striker? Will you strike my enemy? Not people, but the enemy that's behind what makes people nasty or mean or treat us with injustice or racism or whatever it may be. God, will you strike that enemy down? I think that's such a big difference too, isn't it? It's not strike down people, but strike down the enemy who motivates and drives people to act in ways that are so out of harmony with the will of God and the ways of God. So just let's be thankful today. Let's spend some time in prayer and just thanking God for striking the enemies. I mean, the big one, the enemy that Jesus struck on the cross and took him out, the ultimate enemy, the enemy of death. By death, he conquered death. It's just amazing. He has struck down the big enemies, hasn't he? Sin and death, and the devil. He's struck those down already. So in essence, the enemy's big strikers are gone. He has no power out there on the field in which we play, the field of life. So today, again, let's just thank God for being our striker and invite him to strike against the enemy that is causing situations in our lives that would make us feel like losers, because we're not. We are on the winning team. God will strike down the enemy. He will prevail. That's good news. Let's rest on that today. God bless. We'll talk tomorrow.